Welcome to ModPath Chat, the official podcast of modern pathology, featuring interviews with authors and experts on the latest science, technology, and developments in the field of pathology. Your host, Dr. George Netto, is the editor-in-chief of Modern Pathology and the chair of pathology at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Here's Dr. Netto.
Hello, everyone. My guest today is Dr. Nancy Joseph, Associate Professor of Pathology at UCSF. Dr. Joseph is an expert GI pathologist with many areas of interest, but he has, as it pertains to today's conversation, special research interests in pancreatic neuroendocrine neoplasm. We will be discussing her team's recent publication on providing an integrated approach to differentiate grade 3 pancreatic neuroendocrine tumors, or PanNET, from pancreatic neuroendocrine carcinoma, or PanNEC. Thank you, Nancy, for coming to our podcast.
Thanks so much, Dr. Netto, for inviting me. I've certainly enjoyed listening to other podcasts, so it's a real pleasure to be here today.
Wonderful. We're so glad to have you. So this is somewhat of a little complicated topic, at least for people who don't do this every day like me. And I learned a lot from your introduction. I wish we had the time to talk about all the information you put in the background. But if you can just quickly share with me and the audience, what is the current status? You know, there's a lot of refinement in PanNET versus PanNEC and grading. Just briefly, what are the criteria, or how do you approach it currently in your practice? Yeah,
no, it's definitely a complicated topic, for us as well. And a lot of this is because we've recently, in the last decade, learned a lot more about neuroendocrine neoplasms. And initially, it was thought that these were all on a single biological spectrum where, the well-differentiated low-grade 1 and 2 were called NETs. And once they got to be higher grade, we used to diagnose them all as NECs. However, a lot of data from many groups have basically shown that these are actually not at all on a single biological spectrum. NETs, the well-differentiated cases, are biologically distinct from NECs. And so they have frequent alterations in genes like MEN1, DAXX, ATRX, PTEN pathway genes, SETD2, whereas NECs don't have frequent alterations in any of those genes. Instead, they have frequent alterations in genes like P53 and RB1, which are often co-altered, and as well as genes of site-specific adenocarcinoma of each site. So, for example, in the pancreas, pancreatic NEC also often have mutations in KRAS or SMAD4, in addition to the TP53 and RB. So in 2017, the WHO came up with a new classification system where there's now like two completely distinct groups. There's a grade, the well-differentiated NETs, which can now be grade 1, grade 2, or grade 3. You can have a high-grade, well-differentiated NET, which is completely separate from NEC. And it's thought that the G3 NETs arise from lower-grade NETs, where NECs are thought to arise from adenocarcinoma or squamous cell carcinoma. While this is a huge advancement, it presents a big new challenge, which is how do you distinguish the high-grade NET, the G3 NET, from the NEC, when we used to call them all one thing and they still have the same diagnostic grading criteria of a Ki-67 of greater than 20% or a mitotic rate of greater than 20 per 2 millimeters squared.
So that's truly a challenge, and is good. It seems we know where this is heading, and the gist of your study is is that seems like these molecular markers and maybe some immunomarkers and hence the integration. So let's talk a little bit about the study and what kind of cohort, how large of a cohort was this, and what panels you used, and just briefly before we jump to the results.
Yeah, so I should say prior to our study, several pathology faculty at Memorial, including Laura Tang and David Klimstra and Olga Basterk, they've done a lot of work in this area as well. And they had a paper saying, okay, yeah, so these things are, have a lot of morphologic overlap and grading overlap, but they had a paper basically saying, if you do IHC for P53, ATRX, DAXX, and RB, that will greatly improve your distinction of these entities. And so we did our own study because we actually still found it extremely challenging to distinguish the entities, even with those additional immunostains. And so we did our own study. We pulled 47 cases from our archives as well as multiple other institutions. And, we did the IHC that they recommended, and we had 4 different expert GI pathologists look at the cases. And we were still, although the Memorial group said they could reach a consensus in greater than 90% of the cases with these IHC, we still had 40% of the cases were ambiguous or no consensus. And so we were wondering, why is this totally different in our hands? So we also sequenced all the cases and did additional immunostains, including acinar markers and P16. And, with everything combined, we could then get to a 90% clear classification.
That's basically, it's for us mortals, we have to do a little more than I can joke about David Klimstra. He's one of my mentors when I was still a fellow at Memorial. So they probably can do it with a few markers. But this study seems to expand what kind of applications we need to really, for all of us to do it reproducibly and really distinguish these two entities. So I think you had around 47, if I'm not mistaken, cases in this, and they were all called before high grade. I'm trying to look. 47 high grade neoplasm. They were originally diagnosed as just high grade pancreatic neoplasm, right? Neuroendocrine.
Yeah. Yes, definitely.
And so you did the gene panel, which is a 500 gene. And it's an in-house gene panel or what?
Yes, it's an in-house gene panel that's capture-based and covers 500 genes as well as copy number and some fusions. And so when we put all of the data together, what we saw was that these, for the most part, easily broke up into tumors that had, the typical NET alterations like MEN, DAXX, and ATRX. The surprising thing in this group was that P53 was indeed altered in about 35% of cases in this group, which is much higher than what was previously described. It was described that P53 should be less than 10% of well-diff NET. And actually, in the prior studies from Memorial, they didn't see any cases with P53 in their high-grade NETs. So that's one big difference that we noticed. And P16 was also, CDKN2A was also commonly deleted in PanNET. However, it was never in combination with a P53 mutation. So there was never a co-alteration of those two genes. On the other hand, when you look at the NEC genetics, there were frequent alterations of RB, which we didn't see in NET. So RB seems to be more specific than P53. And not only that, but it was commonly co-altered with P53. And in cases that were RB wild type, there were frequent alterations in other cell cycle genes, also in combination with P53. So this NEC genetics typically has a co-alteration with P53 and a cell cycle gene, more than half of the time of which is RB, and can be others in the other proportion. Another really interesting thing we saw in our data were that about 20% of our cases that came in as either like high-grade NET or NEC were actually acinar cell carcinoma with extensive neuroendocrine expression. And I mean, they had the majority of the cases had diffuse synapto, and some also had diffuse chromo. So you can see why they weren't thought to be acinar cell carcinoma originally. But surprisingly, these cases genetically looked nothing like the NETs or the NECs. Even though they had so much neuroendocrine expression, they actually looked genetically like pure acinar cell carcinoma. So they had alterations in genes like ATM, APC, STK11. And this group actually had the best outcomes in our study. This was the only significant difference in outcomes in this study, was much better overall survival for patients with the ACC with neuroendocrine expression compared with both high-grade NET and NEC.
So that's very important to distinguish that group.
Yeah, so definitely one of the big takeaways is anytime you have a case with synapto and chromo from the pancreas, do not forget your acinar cell markers. Even if it's like blazing positive for synapto and chromo, you should definitely throw on trypsin or a lipase on that.
And chymotrypsin. and so yeah. And that's important to mention, that in addition to the immunos that for the same genetic markers that you mentioned, including mTOR and others, you also did chymotrypsin and trypsin and lipase on these too, and that's how you caught the ones that have acinar differentiation.
Yes, correct. So I mean, so this group of 20% of our cases explains some of the discrepancy that we had between us and Memorial, because in their studies, they learned this lesson a long time ago, and they first excluded these cases. They did their acinar markers up front and took those cases out of their study. But we still had a significant number of ambiguous cases even without those. And actually, we did send our ambiguous cases to David Klimstra and Olka to look at. And I mean, they only resolved 30%. So even our cases, they have more trouble with our cases than their original paper. So it is quite challenging.
It's just a matter of the more you do cases and you apply the initial algorithm, you realize you need to expand that algorithm or that battery, and the integrated approach is always superior. And it doesn't seem to be that prohibitive. You know, we're doing a lot of gene panels on these, and now they're reimbursable. So with a few additional immunos. So it sounds like, because that's an important distinction, and it's going to impact, from my reading again, especially your beautiful introduction. And I want the listeners to go and read the paper and look at figure 2 and 3, where you really show an example of an ambiguous case and show exactly the immunoprofile about the cell cycle markers, P53RB and ATRX and all that. It's beautifully illustrated. So it's really a wonderful manuscript, and we're we were so pleased that you submitted to us, and we were able to publish it. So, and I must say, incidentally, that both David and Olga are co-authors on the paper. So
yes.
And it's a great team of investigators. So team science always. So what's next step? You think this is what you're going to apply now in your practice when you're faced with a high grade neuroendocrine neoplasm? Try to see if it's grade 3 NET versus carcinoma.
Yeah. So there's quite a few next steps actually, because as I said, there's a lot more p53 alterations in the well-diff G3 NET than we previously appreciated. And it turns out the majority of those, like greater than 80% of those with p53, had prior treatments. And so one of the next steps is to try to figure out if this alteration actually arises in response to treatment and which treatments. We also had 2 very unique cases that remained ambiguous that, not only did they have the NET genes and p53, but they also had the co-alteration of RB. And those also had prior treatments. So, trying to figure out this extent of overlap and possibly which treatments might actually, create an environment of selective pressure for, a NET to turn into a NEC, or if we're going to call that a transition to NEC, and how we're going to treat it. So, a lot of the work I'm doing now is trying to correlate these genetics, especially the cases with overlap, trying to correlate that with treatment response and outcomes, overall outcomes. Because I think at the end of the day,
that's what
that's what response to treatment and outcome is going to be what determines final classification of these things, or maybe we'll start diagnosing them with their genetics in the top line. So there's a long way to go still.
God forbid we don't go the way neuropath went, where everything is purely genetics. And so wonderful. Wow, this has been a very instructive and engaging conversation. And thank you, Dr. Joseph, for all your work and for following our podcast and being now a guest on it. And I look forward to those upcoming papers on the topic. So modern pathology would be a great home for them too.
Thank you, Dr. Netto, for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Any opinions expressed in this podcast are the speaker's own and do not represent the views of Modern Pathology, Springer Nature, UAB, or USCAP. Your ModPath Chat host and scientific director is Dr. George Netto. Producers are Christina Crow, Amber Jackson, Dr. Sarah Jang, and Dr. Catherine Ketchum. Technical direction is provided by Kaminsky Productions, music by Mitch Neubauer. Thanks to the authors, reviewers, and editors of Modern Pathology for making this podcast possible.